Good afternoon, everyone. Properly, thank you so much for being here. As always, I am Meeker, Deputy Director of the POPVOX Foundation, former caseworker, former casework manager, forever casework nerd. I hope everyone is hanging in there. I know it is a absolutely crazy season for Congress, for congressional staff, and especially for caseworkers. As many of you are handling hurricane aftermath, I know there are 111 active disaster declarations around the country, or emergency declarations around the country. Lebanon is happening, so I know there is a ton going on, and I'm more grateful than ever that you all are spending your time with us today. Hope folks are hanging in there through this wild season and taking care of yourselves and each other. So I am so excited for today's topic. So earlier this year, I was at my desk, probably writing the Navigator newsletter, and all of a sudden my phone just blew up. I got a bunch of texts, I got a bunch of emails from people all going, "Hey, have you seen this new report?" And they sent me the wonderful new report for the Administrative College of the United States called Agency Management of Congressional Constituent Services Inquiries, and I did immediately drop everything to read it. And it lived up to the immediate excitement. It was a wide-ranging and fair view of constituent services, not only from the caseworker side, but especially from the agency side. I've had so many conversations with caseworkers over the last few years about how no matter how dialed in the process is on the congressional side, casework effectiveness always comes down to how can caseworkers interact with agencies? How are the agencies ready to respond to caseworkers and really be ready to do those inquiries, to just handle them and make sure the constituents get the answers that they're looking for? So today, I am so honored that we are joined by the report's author, Boston University Clinical Associate Professor of Law, Sean Kealy. Sean, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad people are finding the report useful.
And I have to read your full bio because you are actually connected back into casework and legislatures before your law career. So you were a Massachusetts Assistant Attorney General from 1995 to 1999, where you worked on victim compensation claims and prosecuted insurance fraud, and then did a stint in legislative work, including some familiarity with casework, as a legal advisor to State Senator Cynthia Stone Cream and counsel to the General Court's Joint Committee on Criminal Justice and the Joint Committee on Revenue, where I think you handled all of the cool topics coming through the legislature.
I don't know if he'd call tax law cool, but that's...
This is a community of nerds. We're here for the weeds. Professor Kealy currently teaches constitutional law, criminal law, and procedure, legislative process at Boston University, and also close to my heart as a newsletter writer. He co-edits a newsletter on changes to criminal law. So Professor Kealy, thank you. Let me just say again, thank you for your hard work on this report and for joining us today. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So for those of us, well, let me say, the first thing that I did when people sent me this report, all of them at once this summer, was Google the Administrative College of the United States. I am sorry that I had never heard of it. So can you tell us a little bit about what ACUS is and what it does?
Yeah, ACUS is the Administrative Conference of the United States, and it's a small independent agency that researches how to make government work better. Former Justice Scalia was actually one of the first heads of the agency after it was set up in the 1970s. Yeah, they have a terrific staff there, and really the way the staff interacts is that they either write reports themselves or they find consultants like myself to hire on particular issues, and then the reports and the recommendations go before the ACUS plenary, which happened in June, and the plenary session is. There's a group of presidential appointees who are the counsel for ACUS, several senior fellows, but also fellows and public members. Most of them are coming from agencies. I think most agencies have some liaison to ACUS, but there's a good number of academics as well, mostly administrative law experts. And they review the reports, they review the recommendations. There's really an extensive committee process that these go through before they're finally adopted. And so I think we were working on the report drafts, starting in February, right up until the plenary session in June. And we had, I think, three-hour Zoom meetings of one particular committee of ACUS that were reviewing line by line the recommendations. And so at the plenary session, I presented my work. The committee chair presented the recommendations. We debated a little bit about, what the effect of these recommendations would be and perhaps how to make them better. And then ultimately ACUS adopted the report and the recommendations and published them on their website.
Amazing. So no one can in any remote way say that these recommendations have not been thoroughly vetted.
Oh, they were vetted. and I have to say, they were tremendous. The both the agency personnel and the outside members of the plenary very dedicated to trying to work through these recommendations and make them usable, but also as precise as they possibly could. So it was a great experience.
And that's certainly reflected in the report. Again, I just dropped the link in if anyone hasn't had a chance to read it yet, but it really is a masterwork. So can you tell me a little bit about so you said the administrative college kind of picks a topic and then finds the right person to write it. Do you have a sense for where this topic came from and why this became a subject of focus for ACUS?
Yeah, I think the staff for ACUS gets together frequently, and they think about what challenges agencies are facing, and I think over and over again they were hearing from agencies that one of the more challenging aspects that they have is trying to work through these constituent service requests coming from Congress, and they noticed that there were a lot of variations between agencies as to how the process went, and perhaps how responsive they were to Congress. And so they wanted to take a more comprehensive look and take a look at it and come up with some best practices. And so and really they put out the call for somebody to do this, and because I had worked for the Massachusetts legislature, I don't want to fool anybody. My primary job was never casework. I probably don't have the patience for it that our audience has. But I did have a chance to work on many case files over the course of the time I was there. And, I had a pretty good appreciation for how difficult it is. It's difficult for the staff in the legislature and certainly in Congress, and it's very difficult for the agency to be responsive. Sometimes for technological reasons, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes for just, cultural reasons, the way the agency has always done things. And so I was excited to have the chance to kind of work through some of this.
And that's wonderful. And I feel like I can just feel caseworkers like nodding and or banging their heads against their desks and screaming as you talk about just the variety of practices that agencies use to respond to inquiries. So I'll say just for me, the experience of reading this report was certainly validating. So I appreciate that. Can you talk a little bit about the process of your research here? I know you talked to caseworkers, you talked to agencies. Just how did these conversations go?
Yeah, about a year ago, I started conducting a survey. And what I did was I identified the people who had been nominated for excellence in constituent service work by the Congressional Management Foundation. And I went back several years and I grabbed, all the nominees, not just the winners, and determined that it was a good bipartisan group. Had some senators in there as well as quite a few reps. And so I reached out to the caseworkers in each of those offices and asked them either to reply in writing or to have a short Zoom with me to go through the answers. And so there were about 20 questions that I was asking. And everything was to remain confidential. I wanted them hopefully to speak as frankly as possible about particular agencies, which ones were very responsive, which ones weren't, which ones were really difficult to work with, as well as, the ones that they consistently got great service from. And so I had a lot of information. I asked them about what they thought best practices would be. What's the best way to communicate with an agency? What's the best way to get an answer? What information they needed? What the roadblocks seemed to be? And then after I had talked to the people on Capitol Hill, I used that information to target certain agencies. And everybody in our audience knows which agencies get the most business from Congress. So I really tried to talk to the biggies. I referenced a couple of agencies in my report: USCIS, the IRS, Social Security. But we also talked to a couple of smaller agencies. The Small Business Association was one of them, and just to get a sense of what they're doing right and what perhaps they wish they could be doing if they had help from Capitol Hill. Yeah. So once I had talked to all of these folks, we started to collate the findings and write up the report.
That's awesome. And then as far as just help from Capitol Hill, that kind of brings us to the recommendations themselves. Can you just walk through a couple of the headliners?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we thought that would be really helpful was that if agencies had clear standing operating procedures, that not only for their internal use, and several of the agencies, I asked every agency I talked to share their procedures with me. Some did, some had a standing rule not to, and that was fine. But it was interesting to see how different the procedures were. And, sometimes you could see obvious gaps that perhaps hadn't been thought about or put into writing. And it would be really helpful if these agencies were able to have a more comprehensive set of standard operating procedures, but to use them perhaps in a different way, that the procedures aren't just for internal use and to train people at the agency, but also to be shared with members of Congress and their staffs, but also constituents, and to have the procedure be as clear as possible to everybody. Something I return to over and over again in the report is that one of the most difficult things for congressional staff to do is to manage the expectations of their constituents. Constituents don't realize what members of Congress can and can't do. And obviously, you can't have a situation where going to your congressman makes it possible for your case to jump the line or to demand a favorable outcome. And I think having the standard operating procedures available and understandable to constituents would help manage those expectations. Some of the procedures were, a nice compact document. The U.S. Postal Service had an 11-page document that I thought was useful. A much more comprehensive set of procedures is the IRS. Anybody who has spent time with the Internal Revenue Manual knows what I'm talking about. It's it's quite a document, and I spent a lot of time sifting through it last winter. But it's comprehensive, but no one's going to be able to find the stuff that they need in that. And it's going to take, it would be nice to have a standalone document that could be shared and easily understood. Some of the other, I don't want to spend all the time on procedures though. Some other aspects of it were not only managing the expectations, but having clear metrics for success. A lot of the agencies try to do this, especially those with better case management systems in place, where they were able to say, well, from the time the casework inquiry came in until resolution was 4 weeks, and that's within our 5-week target, and therefore we're going to consider that a success. But you can do much more establishing those. Was the file completed in a certain amount of time? Was the agency able to work with the congressional staff to complete that file without closing it out, which can be very frustrating for members of Congress and their staff? Was the agency made aware, and especially the senior officials in an agency, were they made aware of a potential systemic problem that could be addressed agency-wide that would prevent future congressional inquiries. And all of that would be extremely helpful. Also, technology. And this was something I spent some time on because the technology out there is very, very uneven. Some agencies have done a pretty good job of updating their case management systems. Makes it a lot easier for congressional staff to submit documents to check up on the case without making a phone call every single time. It allows multiple members of the agency or multiple departments to work on a file without it getting lost or kind of lost in the shuffle. And also there's this new, I mean, the technology of portals is something that I think we're going to be hearing a lot about, where some agencies have started to adopt portals, but there's some very real challenges to adopting those. And, perhaps would make things a lot more efficient, a lot more predictable. And yet some of these challenges are very real, legal or otherwise. The good news is most agencies have abandoned faxes, which
Well, these are good news where we can get it.
This is going to date me terribly, but when I interned for Senator Kennedy back in the 1980s, it was the very first time I ever saw a fax machine. I thought it was just a wonder. But, that was a long time ago, and fax machines shouldn't be in any office anymore. And yet the IRS clings to them because they don't want to, or they legally can't send information by email or some other electronic means. So there's some real barriers there.
Definitely. And I want to put a pin in the question about what the IRS legally can and can't do on constituent services and circle back to it. Because just to dig in for a second on the metrics, you mentioned just how helpful it would be for the agencies to have clear definitions of success. And you brought up something in here that I think is a new idea and would be really helpful for caseworkers to also think about success here, which is the idea of tracking how many inquiries required multiple cycles of outreach from the congressional office as a measure. Like, did the agency answer the question or resolve the issue on the first round? Can you say a little bit more about that? I think that is so helpful.
Yeah, and I think that might be a disconnect between congressional staff and agencies, where obviously what the congressional staff needs and wants is to be able to, it'd be nice to have a successful success to bring back to your constituent, but at the very least, I think it's give the constituent a clear answer one way or the other and make them understand why it turned out that way. That at the very least, their case was considered by the agency. It was, they were heard, their issue was thought about, and what exactly it was that kept them from getting the positive outcome. And the agency, on the other hand, is looking at it as being, I've got this flood of inquiries coming in. How do I resolve them as quickly as possible? And I think that's that sometimes becomes a problem because the file might get closed out because it's missing a document, and then the congressional staff gets frustrated because they have to start over again. Sometimes it's the agency just considers the inquiry frivolous, and quite frankly, the congressional staff may totally agree. You have, it's kind of a new phenomenon, but I don't think they're going to go away. The sovereign citizen tax deniers, we just don't need to file our taxes. And so perhaps their inquiry to Congress is frivolous. Interestingly, the Internal Revenue Service in their manual, it actually states, all inquiries have to be completed, whether you think it's frivolous or not. And I thought that was an outstanding point, that if the agency really saw themselves as a partner with the with the congressional staff and satisfying their constituents' need for information, if not a successful outcome, then everything would work much better. And so deciding that something is frivolous, it may very well be, but, the constituent really needs to get an answer at some point.
Definitely. And it feels like there's kind of an echo there with the IRS saying that we will respond no matter if we think it's frivolous. And the fact that the IRS is, to my knowledge, maybe differently, the only agency that has an explicit taxpayer bill of rights saying that this is how taxpayers will be treated by our, there seems to be an echo there that I find really interesting.
Yeah, no, very much so. And they also have the Taxpayer Advocate Service, which, really seems to be a wonderful resource. But yeah, and another thing that's in the IRM that I thought was terrific, and I put it in the appendix of my report, was kind of do's and don'ts of dealing with Congress. Where respond within a certain amount of time and be courteous, but on the other hand, don't shy away from explaining exactly why the IRS can't help in this situation. So.
And that really, circling back to the idea of just Congress and the agencies working in partnership. Oh, and before I forget myself, clearly I have so many questions for Professor Kealy here. So folks, please, please, please use the Q&A function. Drop in questions as you have them. We will have plenty of time for Q&A if I don't steal it all. So please get in here with your questions if you have them. But circling back on Congress as a partnership with the agencies, clearly, yes, some of your recommendations could be addressed by the agencies themselves if leadership prioritizes them. And then others do need congressional action. You talked about the IRS being legally required to send faxes. Like, that's a legislative fix. And some of these may be a funding fix. CRMs and portal systems are not cheap to implement, even if they do save. Probably, I assume, I'd love to make the case that they outweigh their cost in time savings, but I don't have the data there. So are there places where you see a clear role for Congress in saying, hey, this is how, hey, agencies, this is how we want you to partner, and here's kind of how we're going to write legislation to back that up?
Yeah, I think, some of the problems of adopting technology are going to be legal, and they're going to need a congressional fix. Just staying with the IRS for a moment, the Internal Revenue Code has to be changed in order to adopt portals in any meaningful way. And it's also going to take quite a bit of time for people to really get used to those with the IRS. As one member of the IRS told me, we have to undo decades of telling taxpayers that we'll never contact them by email, and get them used to the idea that you can be contacted by the IRS and use a portal in order to do what you need to do. And that's going to be a huge obstacle. There's no two ways about it. I mean, part of it, when you say what can Congress do, there's the agencies, of course, complained about the lack of funding at times, and the need for the proper amount of funding in order to put these systems into place and to make their systems better. The IRS, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. I mean, it goes through a period of feast and famine over the course of the decades. And right now, they seem to be getting the resources they need in order to update all of their systems. But you have other agencies that seem to have very few resources. I won't name one, but they had no idea what a portal was or the fact that other agencies had been adopting them, and said, wow, that sounds like a great idea, but we hadn't really considered it. So I mean, it's really difficult when some agencies are much more favored than others when it comes to funding. So that's a very real concern. And but there will be a need for some of these legal changes as well. And I think it's something that the congressional staff will will certainly embrace, it was an aspect of my paper that I thought was fairly important, was that the need for trainings and for meetings between agency personnel that handle these inquiries and congressional staff really needed to almost be stepped up in the wake of COVID. That it became much too easy to, just meet electronically through Zoom rather than establishing the relationships that perhaps were being formed before COVID, and to be very intentional about forming those relationships, because the deeper ties between the agency and the congressional office, it just makes everything easier. People have an easier time talking to each other, exchanging information, understanding what the other person needs, and how much difficulty they're facing on either side. So, those are some of the recommendations. I would say that hopefully Congress can initiate this as well as the agencies can, to if not have formal trainings for new people, but also just informal meetups to exchange ideas and to talk about how things are going.
Definitely. That was one thing that really struck me from your report. I kind of had the sense of it working as caseworker handling multiple agencies, but just how little the agencies talk to each other about how they handle constituent services inquiries. So your report is kind of the first forum for them to say, oh, this is how you're doing it. This is how you're doing it.
Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, if somebody can borrow some good ideas from the Postal Service or from, USCIS, then that's wonderful.
Definitely. And I know when we're thinking about casework and just where does casework go, we just keep coming back to is just how little casework is understood outside of just its narrow lane, and caseworkers themselves and the agencies, even the agencies not really understanding, well, this is, the reality of handling casework on the congressional side. Anything where it really stood out, where it really struck you just how little, was there something that was kind of misunderstood between each side that really stood out to you in the course of this report?
I don't know if it was so much misunderstood by each other. I feel like you have the agency liaisons really understand what's going on in Congress, or the need for them to be meeting these inquiries. I think some of the problem comes from the rest of the agency that doesn't quite have that appreciation. And again, if you had an understandable operating procedure that could be shared with the departments that perhaps were providing the information that was needed, or, inquiring into what was going on with this particular issue, then they too would have a better understanding of what it was that Congress needed and what they were looking for.
That is really interesting. And maybe on the same lines, we have a great question from Amanda Torbush. She said, loved this report. Did you find that agencies had requests of congressional offices regarding casework? I know your paper is largely focused on recommendations to agencies, but I wonder if there were agency requests as well. I love this question.
Well, it was not part of my mandate from ACUS. ACUS, rightfully, in my opinion, did not want to be seen as telling Congress what to do, and stay away from this notion that Congress should be doing X, Y, and Z. I don't know if there was anything that the agencies really were looking to send a message back to Congress through this. And in part because I explained to them right up front that my goal was to just understand what agencies were doing and how to give best practices to them. Obviously, there's the funding issue. I mean, and this is kind of my own personal opinion rather than coming from any agency. But I think it's the funding, and it was, taking constituent service as serious. That's a bad way to put it. I mean, Congress takes constituent service very seriously. I mean, they dedicate so many staff members to it. But on the other hand, when it comes time to giving the agencies the technology that they need or the legal changes that they need in order to better serve them, it isn't always there. And that's very frustrating, I think. And again, I'm not speaking for any agency or agency as a whole or ACUS. But, you know, I think an interesting aspect of it, and I'll come back to the oversight part, was that it was interesting to me that some agencies came out and said, we treat every congressional inquiry as an oversight inquiry, that we see it as Congress watching what we're doing, judging what we're doing, and, you know, perhaps looking for changes that could be made for the agency due to this individual case. And that really rang true with me because, you know, so often working for the state legislature, I was made aware of the various constituent inquiries that were coming into the office, and we would, rather than just looking at that one individual case, we would ask ourselves, well, are many people having this problem? And is there a fundamental problem with the agency? At one point, our version of the IRS is the Department of Revenue, DOR. And a couple of small business people in our district called and said, we can't get anybody on the line to tell us about this particular program. And so it was a matter of talking to the Commissioner of Revenue and to that department and trying to sort out what the systemic problem was. And so it can very easily turn into an oversight issue. And so it was interesting to me that agencies automatically assumed that was the case. And at least one agency had a monthly report go to the senior administrators talking about the various issues that they were dealing with and making recommendations for how it could be dealt with at an agency level rather than individual constituents.
I love that. I will say there are so many little pieces, the best practices that you've picked up and highlight in your report that seems like they would be phenomenal questions to ask at a hearing, for example, with an agency head.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think they, you know, sometimes people, maybe even congressional staff themselves, but also certain agencies will just kind of be like, okay, here's the problem we have. It's this constituent in this state. We'll fix their problem and then move on. When, you know, in many ways, I think that might be a missed opportunity.
Yeah, it's kind of the customer service imperative, kind of at odds with the broader policy. Yeah, that's an interesting way to frame it. Yeah. And realize my words, not yours, but yeah.
And it's actually, I was just writing this up for a blog post, actually, you know, my experience doing this report. And one of the more interesting debates that took place at the ACUS plenary was whether Congress should be involved in these issues at all. That, and again, I had to beg off and say, look, that wasn't my job. But we engaged in a very interesting debate. I actually took a bit of criticism for early drafts of my paper because the people were criticizing the fact that I was holding constituent service up as something very noble and necessary for the country. And they were like, no, you know, it shouldn't exist at all. And, you know, it's just a political exercise by members of Congress to gain votes, which I pushed back on very respectfully. Some of the people making that argument is a close friend and a colleague. But you know, it's the sense that Congress kind of breaks the system so that they can swoop in and fix things for constituents in order to garner votes. It just doesn't ring true with me. I mean, it wasn't my experience with the legislature. It wasn't my experience talking to the congressional staff for this report. That, you know, it's not like Congress needs more work to do. They don't need to make work. And in fact, if there was a solution to clean up, you know, a whole category of complaints that typically come in from constituents, that would be an unqualified good, because then they could spend their time and energy on other issues that perhaps were more unusual. So, you know, I think this is something that really needs to be examined more. I mean, in theory, everybody who contacts an agency should be able to get tremendous customer service and get an answer and get an understandable explanation for the decision. And if there is a problem, perhaps go to the agency ombudsman, which in many cases work very well. But I just don't see how you get around having constituents talk to their members of Congress if they see something not going the way they want it to. And it's certainly every citizen's right to talk to their member of Congress and to ask them to help out. So,
right there in the First Amendment, the right to petition. Yes,
that's right.
You have a very receptive audience to the importance of casework. I will certainly say that. But it is something that Congress kind of thinks about every few decades. I know in the late 60s, there were a few bills that would have taken casework out of Congress or moved it slightly. So it definitely seems like it's a recurring conversation of how should that role be defined and where should the onus be on the agencies versus on Congress. And that actually raises something I did want to ask about, just about kind of the who of your recommendations. I know whenever we are nowhere near as important as the Administrative College of the United States, but when we just tiny little POPVOX Foundation are thinking about writing a recommendation, we always spend ages on the who. Like, we're never going to just issue a recommendation that says Congress should. It would be, the committee on XYZ and the staff within that committee should. And your recommendations are so helpful, but then must be picked up individually by each agency. Do you have a sense for is part of the problem here that kind of there is no central voice that speaks for casework?
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, and you mean from Congress's side or from the agency side?
From both, kind of on Congress's side as well, that kind of implementing these recommendations would be divided out into a million different committees of jurisdiction instead of just one that says we take on casework.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Congress has had this committee on modernization, which perhaps might choose to take a look at some of these recommendations and adjust congressional procedure the same way. I also suggested in the report that perhaps the House and Senate offices, that I think it's the House Chief Administrative Officer and the Senate Office on Education and Training, that they become, or at least continue doing what they've been doing as far as trainings go, and becoming a bridge between especially new congressional staff and agencies. I know both offices run trainings currently, and you'd love to see that even expanded and have more agencies participate. I was a little surprised that the OMB wasn't more involved in talking to the agencies about how they handle these issues. I wonder if it just kind of gets lost. I mean, the OMB has plenty to do. And, constituent service doesn't directly impact what they do, but it seemed like they tend to be a clearinghouse for the various agencies as far as policies go. Perhaps they could become more involved. It's going to be impossible to have a unified system of constituent service. Every agency is different. They have different resources. They have different structures. Some agencies handle everything through field offices, and some do everything in DC. It probably makes the most sense that way. And in fact, some of the agencies were talking about trying to centralize things more in Washington. And I was like, isn't that going to be difficult? Because you've got all these field offices where, congressional staff already have this working relationship with their regional person. It almost seems like you should have more regions and have greater And they were like, no, it'd be more efficient if we put things in Washington. I was like, all right, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's a big question, what's going to work best for that agency. And you want to see some experimentation, but I'm not sure it should be forced upon agencies to have a one-size-fits-all system.
Definitely. And I will say, I certainly value the ability to literally walk to the Social Security office in our district sometimes.
Yeah, and people were really, gave Social Security pretty good praise. I mean, they felt like, that was one of the more responsive offices.
Yeah.
That was nice to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just definitely want to highlight that this wasn't just kind of caseworkers talking about how awful agencies are, that you definitely saw best practices and praise, and we really appreciate it in your report. You had a little appreciation from caseworkers for how hard agency staff work to deliver.
Yeah, and one of the most surprising things actually was in talking to the congressional staff, as I mentioned, I was very careful to have it 50-50 Democratic offices and Republican offices, and I tried to get a good sample from across the country. I was kind of girding myself for certain offices to really, hammer agencies based on ideology rather than pure, how the agency responded to constituent service. And I was very pleasantly surprised. It seems like and again, this was kind of my experience. Constituent service doesn't really have ideological bounds. It's just providing help to your constituents, and there's no Democratic or Republican way to do that. So I was really happy. I was also very happy to not have congressional staff just being down on every agency. It was they were very thoughtful about it and very helpful in pointing me to what agencies do well and what they really could improve.
Which is why, again, caseworkers are the best. I will just yell about this until I die.
Won't get any arguments.
And I'm hogging the whole conversation. We have good questions in the chat. So let's go to Whitney next, who asks, will portals seem to make things more efficient for the agency? Often it doesn't seem like they add as much value for congressional offices. We have found portals sometimes generate faster responses, but usually less meaningful or clear responses. So what would you recommend in terms of how can agencies balance efficiency in closing out items in their portals with actually getting the issues in the inquiries resolved? Such a good question.
Yeah, there's so much about portals, and anybody who's been to the doctor these days knows that portals are not the panacea that I think some tech companies think they are. I mean, people are very reluctant to use them. I know I never remember my password, never mind, the constant sense that somebody's going to break into this portal and steal my information. I heard from one agency that was putting a lot of time and effort into putting a portal into place that about 30% of the congressional offices they deal with just refuse to use the portal at all. Which actually made things much more difficult for them, because then they would get all the documents and they had to have somebody input the documents on their end into the portal so that it would actually access their case management system. And that's a problem. And I think this is going to be something that's going to take some time to sort out. What kind of a portal is going to be the most efficient and effective, one that people are going to be willing to use, and one that's user-friendly. I think they will make a huge difference. It's just from the case management point of view, being able to track who's opened the file and who has been, who has responded, whether they responded in the correct amount of time. I mean, that's all valuable information to have, and it'll be especially helpful to Congress. It seems as though, being able to take the documents and just upload them makes a lot more sense than what we're doing now. So there's great advantages to it. but it's going to take some getting used to, and I would imagine that it'll probably be, a couple of versions before we get something that's truly useful, and that's going to be expensive and time consuming. But on the other hand, I don't know if it's worth just saying, we'll keep doing what we're doing. It doesn't make any sense.
Definitely. And I know this was probably a little bit outside the scope of your report, but I just want to kind of flag it and put a pin in it for future conversations, that there's the other side of that too, which is the congressional CRMs. And that it seems silly that we have a CRM on this side with a portal and a CRM on this side with no portal. So caseworkers are having to manually do the work of transferring one from one to the other, when there are easier ways to do this. So I know some of the CRMs are thinking about how could they make that easier, because they are also hearing from caseworkers about the challenges of having to do that manual data entry over and over and over, that you put it into your CRM. Great. Then you got to go put it into USCIS or whatever. So I think that's definitely part of the internal house tech conversation that I am excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, and I don't want to see IRS information transmitted over unsecured lines. But on the other hand, I mean, with all the technology we have, there's got to be a better system than faxes to get information from IRS to the Capitol Hill congressional staff. So we have to kind of actively try and improve the technology and improve that. But yeah, I agree. I think the agency that I spoke to that really was far along with portals, they were a little surprised by how reluctant many offices were to adopt to it, and they weren't quite sure what it was. I mean, some offices insist on having formally, written letters on paper and mailed to them, which seems to be inefficient and unfortunate. I think ultimately, though, what they want is something that tangible they can share with the constituent on agency letterhead that's signed, that they can say, look, we're not just telling you that we tried. Here's the information from the agency itself, and this is the end of the case. This is all we can do for you. I think that's very helpful for the members of Congress, and you would hate to see a situation where staff members no longer can get something like that because we're so in love with the technology. And again, that's why I kept coming back to the point that agency personnel and congressional staff really had to be partners in this effort, and understand what the other side was going through and accommodate them.
Definitely. And I love that, just like the ethnographic observation that, like, no, this is what makes a constituent understand that we did everything we could, is just so critical. That's something you have to get so in the weeds to really capture, and it's so important. So that's why I love this report so much, that you took the time to do that.
Thank you.
And we have another question from Stephen. It says, thank you for this presentation. We discovered your report this summer when some caseworkers in our office realized there were different understandings of whether agencies are required to respond to a congressional inquiry. State Department and various military have individual procedural requirements for congressional inquiries, whereas other agencies do not have this clear procedure. Is there any recommendation or exploration in your report to have agencies required to respond to congressional inquiries? This is a good one.
Yeah, no. I think I forcefully made the point in the report that agencies should be responsive in all cases to congressional inquiries. You hear the thing that frustrated congressional staff the most were the agencies that took 6-7 months to respond to a congressional inquiry. Even they would point out, even when the member called, we still couldn't get an answer within an acceptable time frame. And then you had other agencies that set a goal of 3 weeks to respond. And if it took any time longer than that, then they would send an interim report just so that the congressional staff knew it hadn't fallen by the wayside. yeah, some agencies just are not responsive, I'm afraid. And that's a real problem. I don't know if, again, because there's no central clearinghouse within the executive branch to kind of force some of these recommendations on the agencies. And again, I'm not sure it's wise to force any solutions on any of them. But it's really up to Congress to press the issue. And again, it becomes a piece of oversight. And again, I'm not speaking for ACUS. This is entirely my own opinion. But I ran across instances where agencies were, called to the woodshed by a congressional committee because they had just been unresponsive, and sometimes they offered good reasons for it. During COVID, as people in this audience certainly know, certain agencies were just flooded with inquiries, and just their main problem was they couldn't hire and train the staff fast enough in order to respond. And so all of a sudden their 3-week window became a 2-month window because they really had no choice. And so, I think it's really important for the oversight committees or the committees that oversee the various agencies to be actively engaged to find out why the delays are taking place. And I wonder, and again, this isn't something I really inquired about, I wonder how often people who deal with constituent service are informing the various committees. The interesting thing about constituent service is that it's oversight writ small. It allows every member of Congress some degree of oversight over an agency. It allows them to really understand what these agencies are doing and how they do it. But I don't know how often that gets transmitted to, say, you're having a problem with USCIS and you transmit those frustrations to the Homeland Security Committee. It would be nice to see some more formal way within Congress to kind of make the committees understand what challenges are out there.
Definitely. I feel like I cannot underline that point enough that, it's Congress is sitting on this incredible trove of really rich, detailed information on how policies were implemented. And somehow it's just not making its way over to where it could be really put to use. So I'm just, thank you for making that point. We probably have one more question. So I see one last one in the Q&A here. Where it seems like the levels of clearance required by some agencies can render the responses disconnected from the original request, like a game of operator. Oh boy. Did you see any differences in the accuracy or helpfulness of responses depending on internal clearance requirements? I can sense some pain and frustration behind this question.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get too far into that. And quite frankly, I'm not sure I would have gotten access to that level of internal operations that I would have needed to truly understand it. I mean, obviously, these agencies are operating under a web of laws that prevent releasing information. The Privacy Act and HIPAA, and, you name it. The IRS code is full of them. And so, not being able to get the clearance for the information can be a very real problem. And in fact, I heard a bit of frustration from the agency personnel working in these central congressional liaison offices, dealing with their own agency and trying to get the answer and not being able to get it from their own people. And I'm sure that I to quote Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. I think they do too. I think they recognize that there are some real legal obstacles to giving Congress what it needs. On the other hand, and I'll return to the standard operating procedures. If there was, a readily available document that clearly stated what they can and can't do, or what's going to pose a problem for them as far as clearances go. Uh, that would be something that the congressional staff can share with their constituent, and perhaps manage those expectations and clear up some, or disabuse them of the idea that they're going to get a quick and easy answer, because it's not always that way.
Awesome. Well, I think we are close to time. Maybe we could just wrap up with one final reflection then. What was the biggest surprise to you in writing this report?
I think the biggest surprise was, that there was no one barrier. There was no one easily identified problem. And part of the difficulty was because all the agencies are so very different. And so it's getting a handle on this and then putting forward best practices wasn't an easy task, because, what's best for the IRS is not best for the Small Business Association and administration. And so, I hope I covered as many issues as I possibly could, and came up with something that most agencies could use. But if you take a look at the appendix in the report, I give some recommendations for a standard operating procedure, and I took that from several agencies. What I was able to lay my hands on, and hopefully it'll be something that causes agencies to look at it and say, "Oh, that's a useful thing for us to include as well. This not so much." But we could be a lot more detailed and clear as to who's handling what, when, where, and how.
Love it. Again, Professor Kealy, thank you so much for your hard work on this report. Again, it was so validating, enlightening to read. Just clearly, there's a lot of groundwork here for improvements on the agency side, for Congress to take action to make all of this work better. So thank you again to you for this report, to ACUS for making it possible, and definitely for being here today and chatting all of us about the process here.
Well, I'm so glad to have been able to talk to you guys. I have tremendous respect for what constituent caseworkers do up on Capitol Hill, and especially during these busy times. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us today. Again, hope folks are hanging in there. I know it is a crazy season, but we are so grateful for you taking the time to chat with us today. As always, just a couple of housekeeping flags on the back end here. All of our resources on casework are available at popvox.org/casework, making it as easy as possible. That's our casework manuals, recordings of our previous webinars, back issues of our newsletter. We will be putting this one up very soon. So if you want to, just passive-aggressively send it to your legislative counterparts. Be like, have you considered? We welcome and encourage that. So we hope that this will be a great resource for you going forward. Also, one ask of you. So we are about to start a new project for POPVOX Foundation. That will be a newsletter looking at the current whole broad brush state of constituent engagement, looking at casework and mail and comms and outreach all in one big package. So I am looking to talk to folks who are leading all of these things. So if you or your outreach counterparts want to have a off-the-record, super laid-back 30-minute conversation with me about how you structure your engagement, please reach out, and I would love to chat with you for that project. If you'd like to be on the list for our Casework Navigator newsletter, or if you have suggestions for future topics, or if there's anything we can do to support you, I am always available at ann@popvox.org, or just reply to your Navigator newsletter. So with that said, thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.